The dog did not bark when the man with the knife entered the restaurant. It did not
Keep your
growl.
hands where I can
It
see
did not
them.
move. People noticed
Everyone
that
stays
first,
calm.
and it made them uneasy. The man holding the leash did not stand up either. He did not shout. He did not warn anyone. Some thought he was afraid. Others thought he was irresponsible. But the dog was watching the door for a reason, and the man in the corner had already decided something no one else understood yet. When the knife finally came down, the room would learn the difference between violence and control. This is not a story about how fast someone can attack. It is a story about how long someone can wait and still save a life. The restaurant was warm and dim, the kind of place where sounds softened as soon as they entered the air. Plates clinked gently, voices overlapped without urgency, and the outside world felt distant, sealed behind glass and habit. Nathan Cole Barrett stepped inside and paused just long enough to understand the space. He was 44 years old, tall and lean, carrying himself with the quiet economy of someone who had learned to waste no movement. His hair had grown longer since leaving the service, dark brown threaded with gray, falling just past his ears in loose, slightly wavy curls that resisted discipline. His face was calm, almost neutral, shaped by restraint rather than expression. His gray eyes did not wander. They measured. Nathan did not choose a table for comfort. He chose the corner. It was the farthest point from the center of the room, pressed against the wall where shadows gathered and attention thinned. From there, he could see the entrance clearly without being seen in return. He pulled out the chair, sat with his back to the wall, and placed himself where the room could not surprise him. At his feet, Brutus lowered himself to the floor. The German Shepherd was nearly 7 years old, large and solid, his black and brown coat lying flat against a powerful frame. His movement was smooth and deliberate, practiced rather than instinctive. He lay parallel to Nathan's leg, chest low, body still, head angled toward the door. Brutus did not blink. He did not watch people. He watched thresholds. The opening and closing of the door held his full attention, every shift in light and motion catalogued without reaction. His ears remained upright, his breathing slow and controlled, as if he were conserving energy for something that might never come. Nathan did not look down at him. He didn't need to. The silence between them was familiar, built over years when words had been unnecessary and often dangerous. The room continued around them, unaware that in its quietest corner a man and a dog had already taken their positions. Nothing happened, and that was exactly how they preferred it. The silence did not come from absence of sound, but from contrast. The restaurant continued to function as it always had, plates moving from kitchen to tables, voices overlapping in casual conversation, chairs scraping softly against the floor. Yet beneath that normal rhythm, something else had taken shape. Nathan remained seated in the corner he had chosen earlier, unmoving, his posture unchanged. Brutus lay at his feet exactly as before, body aligned, head angled toward the entrance, eyes open. The longer that posture held, the more it began to unsettle the room. A man at a nearby table shifted in his seat and glanced over his shoulder. He was in his early 50s, heavy-set, with a weathered face and hands marked by manual labor. Dogs to him had always been noisy, needy creatures, eager to be noticed. This one ignored him completely. He frowned, discomfort rising without explanation, and leaned toward his companion to whisper something under his breath. His companion, a woman a few years younger with tired eyes and a rigid posture, followed his gaze and pressed her lips together. She did not speak, but the look she gave the corner was sharp with judgment. Across the room, a younger couple noticed the same thing. The woman, slim and restless, glanced repeatedly at Brutus, while the man tried to laugh it off, though his laughter thinned each time the dog failed to react. The lack of response drained the humor from the moment. It was difficult to joke about something that refused to acknowledge you. Nathan sensed the shift without looking up. He had learned long ago that tension announced itself before words ever did. Voices lowered slightly. Pauses between sentences stretched just a little longer. Silence pooled where curiosity and unease met. He did not adjust his position or offer explanation. He had learned that explanations often invited arguments, and arguments invited escalation. Brutus registered the change in atmosphere with quiet precision. His ears adjusted subtly, not swiveling wildly, but refining their angle, filtering sound. His breathing slowed further, measured and controlled. He did not look at the people watching him. His focus remained fixed on the doorway, on the place where outside met inside. For him, the room was not defined by tables or faces, but by thresholds. Sarah Whitman approached again, moving carefully through the narrow aisle. At 28, she had already learned that calm was contagious if handled properly. She carried herself with an easy balance, tall and slender, auburn hair pulled back neatly, her expression open and attentive. Years earlier, when her younger brother had gone through a difficult stretch marked by anger and silence, she had learned to speak softly and move deliberately, knowing that pressure only made things worse. That instinct guided her now. She placed a small basket of bread on Nathan's table and asked quietly if he needed anything else. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Brutus, not with fear, but with curiosity, edged by respect. Up close, the dog's age was evident, not in weakness but in restraint. His movements were economical, his stillness purposeful. Sarah felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the recognition of discipline earned through hardship. Nathan answered politely, briefly. His voice remained even, without defensiveness. He did not mention the dog. He did not thank her for understanding. The exchange ended without resolution, leaving the tension intact. Behind the counter, Derek Moore watched the interaction closely. At 36, he carried authority shaped more by necessity than confidence. He had stepped into management after his father's health failed, inheriting responsibility before he felt ready for it. Derek valued order because order made him feel safe. Disruptions, even quiet ones, threatened that fragile sense of control. He noticed the way customers glanced toward the corner, then back at him, waiting. He noticed the subtle change in energy, the way the room seemed to lean away from its usual ease. His jaw tightened. The dog had not barked, had not moved, had not done anything objectively wrong. Yet its presence challenged the unspoken rules of the space. A woman near the window finally voiced what others had only hinted at. She was in her early 40s, neatly dressed, posture stiff with conviction. Her tone was sharp but controlled as she spoke to the people at her table, loud enough to carry. She remarked that animals did not belong everywhere, that rules existed for a reason. Her words landed like a pebble dropped into water, sending small ripples outward. A few heads nodded, others stiffened, but remained silent. Nathan heard every word. He did nothing. He had learned through long experience that reacting to disrespect often granted it more power than it deserved. His stillness was not indifference. It was choice. His eyes remained calm, his hands steady on the table. He did not look toward the woman. He did not correct her. Brutus registered the change in tone instantly. His muscles tightened by a fraction, enough to mark awareness, not enough to suggest movement. His gaze did not waver from the doorway. For him, voices carried less meaning than intent, and intent, at least for now, remained unfocused. Derek felt the pressure mount. He stepped out from behind the counter, smoothing his shirt as if to steady himself. He approached Nathan's table with measured steps, stopping at a respectful distance. At this range, the dog's size and composure were impossible to ignore. Brutus did not acknowledge him. The lack of reaction unsettled Derek more than a growl would have. "There's a concern," Derek said, keeping his voice low, controlled. He gestured vaguely toward the dog, avoiding direct accusation. His tone carried authority, but beneath it was uncertainty. He was used to people responding, explaining, negotiating. Nathan looked up slowly and met Derek's eyes. There was no hostility in his expression, no challenge. He listened. When he spoke, his words were brief and respectful, offering acknowledgement without concession. He did not raise his voice. He did not justify himself. He did not escalate. The exchange left Derek unsatisfied. Silence, in this context, felt like resistance. He nodded stiffly and stepped back toward the counter, his authority technically intact, yet shaken. He felt the eyes of the room on him, felt judged without understanding why. The restaurant's noise resumed gradually, but it did not return to its earlier ease. Conversations restarted cautiously. Laughter sounded forced. People continued to glance toward the corner, drawn by something they could not name. Nathan returned his gaze to the table. The tension slid past him rather than lodging inside. He had lived through moments far louder and far more dangerous. This was discomfort, not threat. Discomfort passed. Brutus remained motionless. The silence stayed, no longer empty, but heavy with expectation. And in that unease, the room waited for something to give. The tension in the restaurant crossed a line without anyone being able to say exactly when it happened. What had begun as quiet discomfort hardened into something more public, more pointed. Voices no longer dropped when they mentioned the corner. They rose instead, sharpened by the confidence that comes when people believe they are on the side of the majority. Nathan remained seated, his posture unchanged, but the air around him thickened, as if the room itself had decided he was now part of the evening's problem. A man near the center of the dining room turned openly in his chair and looked toward Nathan's table. He was in his late 40s, clean-shaven, wearing a polo shirt tucked too neatly into his pants, the posture of someone accustomed to being heard. He did not address Nathan directly at first. Instead, he spoke to the room, his voice carrying just far enough to invite agreement. He questioned why some people thought they could ignore rules, why others had to feel uncomfortable so one person could have their way. His words were measured, almost reasonable, which made them more dangerous. A few diners nodded. One woman murmured agreement. Another crossed her arms and leaned back, watching to see what would happen next. The pressure shifted from quiet judgment to expectation. This was no longer about a dog. It was about whether the man in the corner would respond. Nathan did not. His silence, once merely unsettling, now felt provocative to those who needed reaction to justify their own. He kept his gaze lowered, his breathing steady. He had learned, long before this moment, that not every confrontation deserved acknowledgement. Some moments passed only if starved of attention. Brutus sensed the change immediately. The dog's body did not spring into motion, but something fundamental shifted. His ears angled forward, no longer relaxed into passive listening, but tuned with precision. The muscles along his shoulders tightened subtly beneath his thick coat. His breathing slowed even further, measured to the point of near stillness. Most importantly, his gaze broke from the door for the first time since entering the restaurant. He looked at the room, not at faces, but at movement, at posture, at hands that gestured too sharply, at chairs scraping back just a bit too hard, at the way several people leaned forward in their seats. Brutus did not growl, he did not bare his teeth. His alertness was quiet, almost invisible to anyone who did not know what to look for. Nathan felt it through the leash before he saw it. A slight change in tension traveled upward, a familiar signal passed between them without words. Nathan's hand lowered an inch from the table, not touching Brutus, but close enough to be felt. It was not a command. It was acknowledgement. Across the room, Derek Moore became acutely aware that the situation was slipping beyond polite discomfort. At the counter, he could feel eyes turning toward him, waiting for action. His role demanded intervention, yet every instinct warned him that stepping in now might ignite rather than extinguish the moment. The dog's posture unsettled him more than the murmurs did. Stillness, in this context, felt coiled. Sarah Whitman sensed it too. She stood near the service station, a folded cloth in her hand she had no real reason to be holding. At 28, she had learned to recognize the difference between irritation and escalation. This was no longer about opinions. The room had chosen a target, and once a crowd chose, restraint became fragile. Her gaze flicked to Brutus, then to Nathan. The man had not moved, had not defended himself, had not even looked offended. That somehow made the situation worse. A woman near the window laughed softly, not out of humor, but out of disbelief. Her laughter drew attention, and she leaned into it, making a comment about how ridiculous the whole thing was. Her tone invited others to join, to feel justified in pushing further. The pressure became visible now, no longer hidden beneath polite language. Brutus shifted his weight. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it changed everything. His front paws adjusted, spreading slightly for balance. His head lifted just enough to bring his line of sight level with the room rather than the floor. His eyes, dark and steady, swept across the space once, deliberately. Anyone watching closely would have noticed that he was no longer resting. He was assessing. A man closest to the corner noticed and stiffened. His foot pulled back instinctively, his body reacting before his mind could explain why. A hush rippled outward, brief but unmistakable. People had expected a reaction from the man. They had not expected one from the dog. Nathan did not restrain Brutus. He did not need to. His fingers hovered close to the leash, his posture still calm, his breathing unchanged. Years of trust lay between them, built not on commands, but on shared understanding. Brutus was not reacting to noise or insult. He was responding to pressure, to the subtle shift from words to intent. The room seemed to realize all at once that something had gone too far. Voices faltered. A chair scraped back and then stopped. Someone cleared their throat too loudly. Derek took an involuntary step forward, then froze, unsure whether moving closer would help or harm. The attention that had once been scattered now focused sharply on the corner table. Brutus held his position. He did not advance. He did not retreat. He simply watched, every muscle ready, every sense tuned. His presence filled the space without movement, a silent warning that did not need translation. Nathan finally lifted his gaze. He did not glare. He did not challenge. He looked at the room with calm, steady eyes, not searching for apology or understanding. His expression remained neutral, but there was something unmistakable in it now. Readiness, not aggression, not threat, just the quiet assurance of someone who would not be caught off guard. The misunderstanding had grown teeth. What had begun as discomfort had become public pressure, and in that moment, everyone felt it. Brutus had sensed the shift before any human voice named it, responding not with violence, but with awareness sharpened to its edge. The wrong moment had arrived. And the room, suddenly silent, understood that it could not pretend otherwise. The front door slammed open with a sound that did not belong in the restaurant. It was abrupt, violent, and loud enough to fracture the fragile quiet that had settled moments earlier. Cold air rushed inside, carrying the smell of rain and pavement, before the door rebounded against the wall and shuddered to a stop. Every conversation died at once. The man who stormed in moved with raw aggression, not caution. He was in his early 30s, tall but poorly grounded, his frame lean to the point of sharpness. A dark hoodie clung to his shoulders, damp and wrinkled, and his jeans hung low on his hips, frayed at the edges. His face was hollow, eyes sunken and restless, burning with a reckless intensity that suggested desperation rather than planning. He scanned the room in wide, sweeping motions, not looking for someone specific, but asserting presence, daring the room to resist him. He took 2 steps forward and thrust a hand into his jacket. The knife came out fast. It was long and narrow, the metal worn and uneven, dull in color but unmistakably sharp. As he raised it, the blade caught the overhead light and reflected it across the walls in a quick, blinding flash. He held it at chest height and shouted, his voice hoarse and strained, words tumbling over each other as he ordered everyone to stay where they were. The sound of his voice was unsteady, edged with rage and fear tangled together. Panic erupted instantly. Chairs scraped back violently. A glass tipped and shattered near the bar, the sharp crack echoing through the room. Someone screamed. Another person ducked beneath a table, arms over their head. The orderly rhythm of the restaurant collapsed into chaos as fear spread faster than thought. Near the counter, a young woman froze. She was 18 years old, slender and slightly hunched, as if she had learned to make herself smaller in public spaces. Her dark hair fell loosely around her shoulders, still damp at the ends, and she wore a light jacket over a simple dress, the kind chosen for comfort rather than attention. Her face was pale, eyes wide and stunned, caught between shock and disbelief. She had been standing near the counter, waiting for a receipt, when the door burst open. Now she stood only a few steps from the knife. Her body did not move, not forward, not back. One hand hovered near the strap of her bag, fingers curled as if unsure what to do next. Her breathing became shallow, visible in the slight rise and fall of her chest. She stared at the blade, unable to look away, as though understanding too clearly what it meant to be this close to danger. A woman behind her cried out, reaching instinctively to pull her back. The man snapped his arm toward the movement, the knife slicing the air in warning. The woman recoiled at once, hands flying to her mouth as she stumbled backward. The young woman remained where she was, trapped by the sudden stillness that fear imposes when the body refuses to obey the mind. The man laughed sharply, the sound brittle and unstable, and waved the knife again. His movements were erratic, fueled by impulse rather than control. The blade pointed from face to face, threatening everyone and no one at the same time. He shouted again, louder now, his voice cracking as he demanded silence and compliance. People backed away until tables pressed against their legs and walls offered no further retreat. The restaurant felt suddenly smaller, stripped of its warmth. The smell of food turned sour in the air, overwhelmed by the sharp metallic scent of fear. Conversations were gone, replaced by shallow breaths and the faint whimper of someone struggling not to cry. The young woman near the counter swallowed hard. Her knees trembled, but her feet remained planted. She glanced over her shoulder once, searching for a way out, for someone to meet her eyes and tell her what to do. She found only frozen faces and lowered gazes. When she looked back at the knife, her lips parted slightly, as if she might speak, but no sound came. The man stepped closer. The distance between the blade and her body shrank to a matter of feet. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a silence so complete it felt deliberate, as though everyone had silently agreed that sound itself was now dangerous. No one ran, no one shouted. The chaos folded inward, condensing into a shared, paralyzing dread. The knife rose higher in the man's hand. His grip tightened, knuckles whitening, his breathing loud and uneven in the sudden quiet. The threat was no longer abstract. It stood in the open, armed and unstable, and the young woman remained trapped at the center of it. The shift was almost invisible at first, lost beneath the sound of ragged breathing and the faint creak of bodies pressed too tightly together. Brutus moved without noise, without drama, as if motion itself were something to be rationed carefully. One moment he was beside Nathan's chair, a dark shape grounded against the floor. The next, he was no longer there. He stepped forward. Not fast, not slow. Just enough. The German shepherd placed himself squarely between the knife and the young woman, his broad chest angled slightly outward, his body forming a living barrier that closed the open space the man had been claiming. His paws spread against the floor for balance, claws clicking once before settling. His head lifted to full height, ears forward, eyes locked onto the blade, with an intensity that made the air feel tighter. The room noticed. A collective intake of breath rippled through the restaurant, sharp and involuntary. Someone whispered the word dog, not in fear, but in disbelief. No one had expected movement, not from the corner, not from the animal that had spent the entire evening as still as furniture. The young woman froze again, this time for a different reason. She was 18, her fear raw and unpracticed, but now there was something else in her expression. Confusion, layered with a fragile flicker of hope. She stared at the dog's back, at the solid line of muscle and fur that now stood between her and the knife. Her breath caught in her throat, and she pressed one hand to her chest, as if steadying herself against a feeling she did not yet trust. The man with the knife reacted instantly. His attention snapped downward, rage flashing across his face as he realized what had changed. He shouted again, louder, more erratic, the sound tearing from his throat without control. He swung the knife toward Brutus in a wide, reckless arc, not striking, but close enough that several people cried out. Brutus did not retreat, his muscles tensed visibly beneath his coat, every line of his body drawn tight with readiness. His lips lifted just enough to reveal the edges of his teeth, not in a snarl, but in warning. His eyes never left the knife. He tracked it with precision, adjusting his stance by inches, maintaining the space he had claimed. He was ready. Everyone in the room could see it now. This was not a pet acting on instinct. This was an animal trained for moments exactly like this one, an animal that understood distance, timing, consequence. Brutus's entire body communicated a single truth without sound. Cross this line. The man hesitated just for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Nathan stood. The scrape of his chair against the floor was soft, almost polite, but it carried weight. He moved to Brutus's side with deliberate calm, stopping just behind the dog's shoulder. His posture was upright, balanced, his hands open and visible. He did not rush toward the man. He did not shout commands into the chaos. He simply arrived. Brutus sensed him instantly. The tension in his body did not vanish, but it refined itself, shifting from raw readiness into controlled restraint. The dog did not look back. He did not need to. The presence behind him was familiar, grounding, absolute. The man's eyes flicked between the dog and Nathan now, uncertainty breaking through his aggression. He waved the knife again, but the motion lacked its earlier confidence. His breathing grew louder, more uneven, panic bleeding into the fury that had carried him this far. Brutus held his ground. He did not advance. He did not bark. He did not lunge, even when the blade dipped closer, even when the man shouted directly at him. The German Shepherd's training showed not in what he did, but in what he refused to do. He waited. The young woman edged backward by a single step. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it mattered. Her heel brushed against a chair leg, and she caught herself before she could stumble. Tears slid down her cheeks now, silent and uncontrolled, but she did not look away from the dog. She did not run. She waited, as if understanding that sudden movement might shatter the fragile balance holding the moment together. Around them, the restaurant remained locked in place. Sarah stood near the service station, one hand pressed flat against the counter to steady herself. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear, focused. She watched Brutus closely, recognizing something she had only ever seen once before, years ago, when a police dog had held a violent man at bay outside a burning building. The same tension, the same restraint, the same unspoken promise of force held back by discipline. Behind the counter, Derek's hands shook as he clutched the phone. He had finished the call, but he could not bring himself to lower it yet. His gaze stayed fixed on the dog, on the way Brutus controlled the space without crossing into violence. It struck Derek then, hard and humbling, how thin the line was between chaos and control, and how little authority actually mattered in moments like this. The man lunged half a step forward. Brutus responded instantly, not with an attack, with position. He shifted laterally, closing the angle, keeping his body square between the blade and the woman. His growl rumbled low in his chest, barely audible, more vibration than sound. It was the first noise he had made all evening, and it landed with terrifying clarity. The man stopped. The knife hovered in the air, trembling. Brutus waited. Every instinct trained into him urged release, urged decisive action. The threat was real. The blade was close. The conditions were met. And yet he did not move beyond the line he had drawn. His body held the tension, contained it, trusted what was behind him. He was waiting for one thing. Nathan's voice. Nathan did not raise it. He spoke softly, evenly, the way one spoke to a volatile situation rather than a person. His words were short, controlled, meant to slow time rather than command it. He did not address the crowd. He did not threaten the man. He spoke only enough to anchor the moment, to keep it from tipping. Brutus felt the shift immediately. Not a command yet, just presence, just direction. The dog remained still, muscles coiled, eyes burning, breath steady. He was ready to explode forward if needed, ready to end the threat in a heartbeat. But he waited, because he had been taught that true control was not in the strike. It was in the pause before it. And the room, held in that pause, understood that the line had been drawn, and that crossing it would change everything. The knife moved first. It was not a wide, reckless swing this time, but a sudden, sharp motion driven by panic and rage colliding at once. The man lunged toward Brutus, the blade cutting through the air in a tight arc, aimed low and fast, as if instinct had finally overridden whatever restraint he had left. The sound of metal slicing air was brief, almost delicate, but it carried through the room with terrible clarity. Brutus did not flinch. He shifted his weight to absorb what was coming, muscles tightening, body ready to explode forward at the smallest permission. His eyes locked onto the blade, tracking its path with absolute precision. The distance between steel and fur collapsed to inches. Nathan moved. He did not shout Brutus's name. He did not call attention to himself. He stepped into the moment the way he had stepped into countless others before, calm and exact, his body already ahead of his thoughts. One foot slid forward, cutting the angle the man had created, his shoulder turning just enough to take him out of the knife's direct line. His hand struck the attacker's wrist with controlled force, not a punch, not a blow meant to punish, a precise impact designed to disrupt grip and balance. The man cried out as pain shot up his arm, his fingers spasming. The knife loosened, but did not fall. Nathan followed without hesitation. He closed the distance in a single step, his other hand locking around the man's forearm, while his shoulder drove inward, collapsing the attacker's posture. The motion was fluid, practiced, stripped of excess. There was no wasted movement, no anger behind it, only intent. The knife clattered to the floor. The sound rang out, loud and final, echoing across the restaurant like a bell, signaling the end of something dangerous. Several people screamed again, not from fear this time, but from release. Nathan did not stop. He guided the man down, rotating his arm just enough to force compliance without breaking bone. The attacker's knees buckled, his body folding under the sudden loss of control. Nathan lowered him to the ground, maintaining pressure, pinning the arm securely against the man's back. The movement was firm but measured, a balance between authority and restraint. Brutus stood inches away. His body remained tense, every muscle ready, but he did not attack. He watched Nathan's hands, the position of the man's shoulders, the angle of the pinned arm. The dog understood what was happening, not in human terms, but in outcomes. The threat was being neutralized. The line had held. The man struggled briefly, shouting incoherently, his free hand scraping against the floor. Nathan adjusted his weight, shifting just enough to remove leverage. His voice came low and steady, directed not to the room, but to the man beneath him. "Stay down." There was no threat in the words, no promise of violence, only certainty. The man's resistance weakened, his breathing ragged, panic draining into exhaustion. He lay still, chest heaving, eyes wild but unfocused, now that control had been stripped away. Around them, the restaurant was silent. No one moved. No one spoke. People stood frozen in the aftermath, trying to understand how chaos had collapsed into stillness so quickly. A woman covered her mouth with both hands, tears spilling freely. A man near the wall lowered himself slowly into a chair, his legs shaking too hard to remain standing. The young woman near the counter stumbled backward, finally free to move. She leaned against the edge of a table, one hand gripping its surface as if the world might tilt without it. Her face was streaked with tears, her breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. She stared at the scene on the floor, disbelief and shock fighting for dominance. Then her eyes found Brutus. The dog turned his head slightly, checking her position, confirming distance and safety. Satisfied, he relaxed by a fraction, the rigid tension easing just enough to signal that the immediate danger had passed. Sarah was already at the young woman's side. Her hands were gentle but firm as she guided her toward a chair, speaking softly, grounding her with simple instructions to breathe, to sit, to stay present. Sarah's own hands trembled slightly, adrenaline still flooding her system, but her voice remained calm. Years of caring for others in moments of distress rose to the surface now, overriding her fear. Behind the counter, Derek stared in stunned silence. He had watched the entire exchange unfold in seconds, yet it felt like minutes stretched thin. The authority he usually relied on had been useless. It was control, not command, that had ended the threat. The realization sat heavy in his chest, humbling and unsettling. Nathan remained where he was, one knee pressed into the floor, one hand securing the attacker's arm. He did not look around for approval or acknowledgement. His focus stayed on the man beneath him, on maintaining pressure without escalation. He adjusted his grip once, subtly, ensuring circulation was not cut off, that pain did not become injury. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. The sound grew louder with each passing second, threading through the stillness like a promise. Someone sobbed quietly near the back of the room. Another person whispered a prayer under their breath. Brutus sat down slowly. It was a deliberate choice, not fatigue. He positioned himself beside Nathan, body angled toward the rest of the room, eyes scanning faces and movements. His posture communicated readiness without aggression, a silent assurance that the situation remained under control. The man on the floor stopped struggling entirely. His breathing slowed, his head turned to the side, defeat settling in where fury had been moments before. Nathan held him there, not out of cruelty, but out of responsibility. Letting go too soon would invite chaos back in. When the police finally arrived, their voices cut through the quiet with practiced authority. Nathan did not resist them. He followed instructions calmly, releasing the man only when hands replaced his own, when control passed cleanly from one set of trained professionals to another. He stood up slowly, stepped back, and retrieved the knife with his foot, sliding it away from everyone before kicking it further out of reach. Brutus rose with him, staying close, eyes alert but no longer burning. As the attacker was pulled to his feet and led away, still shouting but powerless now, the room exhaled. People sank into chairs, clutched one another, wiped tears from their faces. Shock lingered, but fear began to loosen its grip. Nathan did not seek the young woman's gaze. He did not need thanks. He did not expect it. His eyes went instead to Brutus, meeting the dog's steady stare for a brief moment. Nothing passed between them that anyone else could see, but the understanding was complete. The threat had been stopped, the line had held, and no life had been taken to make that happen. The sound of sirens faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the chaos that had come before it. The restaurant no longer trembled with fear, but it had not yet returned to life. People remained seated where they were, shoulders slumped, hands still shaking, as if movement itself required permission. The air smelled faintly of sweat and metal, and every breath felt deliberate. Nathan stood near his table, no longer crouched, no longer engaged, yet not relaxed. His posture was upright, balanced, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. The adrenaline had drained from his system with the same efficiency it had arrived, leaving behind a familiar emptiness. Brutus remained close to his leg, seated now, calm but alert, his ears occasionally turning as voices murmured in low tones around them. The young woman who had been trapped near the counter sat with Sarah beside her. She was still 18, still shaken, her hands wrapped tightly around a glass of water she had not yet managed to drink. Her breathing had slowed, though each inhale carried a faint tremor. Sarah stayed close, one arm resting lightly against the back of the chair, her presence steady and unintrusive. Years earlier, after a car accident that had taken a close friend, Sarah had learned that comfort was not about words, but about staying when others felt the urge to flee. That instinct guided her now. Derek Moore stood behind the counter, staring at nothing in particular. At 36, he had never felt older. His hands rested flat against the surface, fingers spread, grounding himself in the solidness of it. He replayed the last few minutes over and over in his mind, each time reaching the same realization. He had been in charge. And yet, when the moment demanded action, authority had meant nothing. It was restraint, experience, and discipline that had saved the room. He looked toward Nathan. For the first time since the man had entered earlier that evening, Derek did not see a problem to solve. He saw someone who had carried responsibility without being asked, someone who had stepped forward not to be seen, but because someone had to. The discomfort Derek had felt earlier now twisted into something sharper. Shame. Derek stepped out from behind the counter and walked toward Nathan, his movements slower than before, stripped of the rigid confidence he usually carried. People noticed and fell silent again, sensing that another important moment was unfolding. When Derek stopped a few feet away, he hesitated. Words, which usually came easily to him in his role, felt heavy now. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, his voice low, rough around the edges. "For earlier? For how I handled things?" Nathan looked at him calmly. There was no anger in his expression, no satisfaction, just attention. Derek swallowed and continued, the words coming more steadily now that he had begun. He spoke about the assumptions he had made, about the pressure he felt to keep control, about how fear had disguised itself as authority. He did not excuse himself. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply acknowledged what had been wrong. Nathan listened without interrupting. When Derek finished, the silence returned, but it was different this time, less brittle, less charged. "You did what you thought you had to," Nathan said at last. His voice was quiet, even. "So did I." It was not absolution, it was understanding. Derek nodded, a tightness easing from his chest that he had not realized was there. He glanced down at Brutus, who looked back at him steadily, not hostile, not warm, just present. "That dog," Derek said, choosing his words carefully. He knew before anyone else. Brutus blinked once, slow and deliberate. "He's trained to notice when things shift," Nathan replied. "Before people admit they have." Derek let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though no humor touched it. He nodded again and stepped back, giving Nathan space he now understood had been earned, not demanded. Across the room, the young woman finally stood. Her movements were tentative, as if the floor beneath her might still be unreliable. Sarah rose with her, staying close but not guiding, allowing the girl to move under her own strength. When their eyes met Nathan's, the young woman hesitated, then spoke. "Thank you," she said quietly. Her voice trembled, but it held. Nathan met her gaze and nodded once. He did not tell her she was safe now. He did not reassure her with promises. He knew better than to offer certainty where none existed. His acknowledgment was simple, respectful. Brutus shifted slightly, as if sensing the exchange, then settled again. Gradually, the restaurant began to breathe. People spoke in low tones, recounting what they had seen, checking on one another. A man helped a woman to her feet. Someone laughed nervously, the sound breaking and then catching again. Life did not resume all at once. It stitched itself back together slowly, unevenly. Sarah returned to the counter and poured herself a glass of water, her hands finally steady enough to trust. She looked toward Nathan and Brutus one last time, a quiet gratitude in her expression, shaped by recognition rather than awe. She had seen fear many times before. She had rarely seen it answered with such restraint. Nathan gathered his jacket and rested a hand briefly against Brutus's shoulder. The dog rose at once, calm, composed, the tension of the night draining from his body without leaving chaos behind. Together they moved toward the exit, not hurried, not lingering. As they passed the tables, conversations paused. Some people looked away, embarrassed. Others watched openly, their expressions changed by what they had witnessed. Nathan did not acknowledge the attention. He had never learned how to carry it comfortably. At the door, Derek spoke again, softer this time. "You're welcome here," he said. "Both of you." Nathan paused, then nodded. Outside, the night air was cool and quiet, the streetlights reflecting off damp pavement. The door closed behind them, sealing the noise and the memory inside. Brutus walked at Nathan's side, his pace even, his focus relaxed now that the threat was gone. Nathan took a long breath, one he had been holding since the moment the knife had appeared, and let it out slowly. Understanding hadn't come through force. It had come through control. And that, Nathan knew, was the only kind that lasted. Morning arrived gently, without ceremony. Sunlight filtered through low clouds and spilled across Galveston's quiet streets, turning damp pavement into pale silver. The town moved slower than it had the night before, as if it too were recovering from something unnamed. Inside the restaurant, chairs had been reset, glass swept away, and the scent of coffee replaced the sharp memory of fear. Routine returned not as a switch flipped, but as a choice repeated. Nathan Cole Barrett came back alone at first. He entered without drawing attention, the same measured presence as before, his hair still falling loosely in soft waves around his ears, his posture calm and unhurried. The jacket he wore was lighter this time, the day warmer, his movements eased by daylight. He paused just long enough to take in the room. It looked ordinary again. That, he knew, was the point. Brutus followed a step behind. The German shepherd's pace was relaxed now, his head level, ears attentive, but no longer rigid. He was nearly 7, his strength intact, his discipline unchanged, but there was a softness to him that morning, visible only to those who knew what to look for. He walked to the same corner table and lay down, positioning himself as before, head angled toward the door. Habit endured. So did purpose. Sarah noticed them immediately. She was already on shift, her auburn hair pulled back, her movements confident in the quiet hours before the lunch rush. The night before had aged her in small ways that did not show on her face, but lived behind her eyes. She approached with a steady smile, one that did not ask questions or reopen wounds. She placed a cup of coffee on Nathan's table without being asked. "On the house," she said simply. Nathan nodded his thanks. Behind the counter, Derek watched for a moment before stepping forward. He looked different, too, less rigid, less armored by authority. He had slept poorly, replaying choices and words, but he had arrived early to open the restaurant himself. Control, he was learning, was not about force. It was about responsibility. "We made a change," Derek said, gesturing toward the door. Near the entrance, a small sign had been placed. It was simple, unadorned, easy to miss if you were not looking for it. The words were quiet, deliberate, chosen carefully. Quiet dogs welcome, respect expected. Nathan read it once and looked away. "That wasn't necessary," he said. "It was," Derek replied. His voice was calm, resolved. "For us?" There was no apology this time, no explanation, just acknowledgement. A few tables filled as the morning progressed. People entered, ordered breakfast, spoke softly. Some recognized Nathan and Brutus and offered small nods, respectful and brief. Others did not notice at all. That, too, was welcome. Peace did not require recognition to exist. The young woman from the night before passed by the window outside. She walked with purpose now, her shoulders squared, her pace steady. She did not come inside. She did not need to. When her eyes met Nathan's through the glass, she paused and smiled, a quiet expression of survival rather than gratitude. He returned the nod. Nothing more was required. Brutus shifted and sighed, a low sound of contentment. For the first time since entering public spaces months ago, he closed his eyes. Not fully, just enough. Nathan noticed and allowed himself a small breath he had not realized he was holding. He rested his hand briefly against the table, grounding himself in the ordinary weight of it. The world outside remained uncertain. It always would. But here, in this moment, vigilance could loosen without disappearing. The restaurant hummed softly around them. Coffee poured, plates arrived. A laugh broke the air and did not shatter it. The morning continued, stitched together by small acts of respect that required no announcement. When Nathan stood to leave, Brutus rose smoothly at his side. They walked toward the door together, unhurried. Derek nodded once. Sarah smiled. No one clapped. No one stared. That was the truest sign of peace Nathan could imagine. Outside, sunlight warmed the street. Brutus paused, looked back once, then continued forward, his tail moving slightly, not wagging, just acknowledging the space they had passed through. Nathan followed, the weight of the night finally settling into memory rather than muscle. They did not save the world. They did not change it. They simply held a line long enough for others to learn where it was. And sometimes that was enough. This story was never really about a knife, a dog, or a man trained for war. It was about a moment when darkness entered an ordinary place and something quieter stood in its way. Sometimes the miracle does not look like fire from the sky. Sometimes it looks like restraint, a steady hand, a loyal companion who waits instead of attacks, a human heart that chooses control over anger when fear would justify anything. In many ways, God works like that in our daily lives, not always loudly, not always instantly, but through people who step forward when others freeze, through courage that protects rather than destroys, through grace that holds the line until danger passes. Every day we face smaller versions of that moment. A harsh word we could answer with silence, a situation we could escalate but choose to calm, a stranger we could judge but instead decide to understand. If this story moved you, let it remind you that you may be someone else's quiet miracle. And sometimes, simply standing firm with faith is enough to change an outcome. If you believe that God still works through ordinary people in extraordinary moments, share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with the word Amen to show your faith and support others reading here. Subscribe to the channel so more stories of courage, grace, and redemption can reach those who need them. May God bless you, protect you, and guide you in the moments when it matters most. Amen.